Hello, it's Joey, and today we're making faux vintage postcards, which are made to look vintage by adding a tissue paper filter. So each of these little cards have an image on the front. On this one I've stamped on beautiful music paper and I've painted it, and then I've added some extra effects which I'll show you how to do today. On this one I've merely taken a page from a book about flowers and I've added that on the left here, along with some washi tape and some extra scrap pieces of paper. Each of these little cards has space to write on the back. On this one in particular I kept some space on the right, so you could do that by just adding some collage paper. They have a border around them. On some of them I've done it with a sewing machine, but also on some I've just added faux stitching. I would use these cards by putting them in a junk journal. So chubby little junk journal from a while ago has an upturned page in here. So I would take one of my cards and just pop it into a pocket like that. These cards are made from just really cheap cardstock, and I've wanted to use this for quite some time. It's the sort that you buy because when you see it, you just love it. But it's really rather vibrant, and when you get it home, you might not know exactly how to use it. I have process steps today as usual, so feel free to take a screenshot of these, and they're also in Pinterest. Let's get on and make these faux vintage postcards. First thing we need to do to create a tissue paper filter, or to cheat with tissue paper as I like to call it, is to add a base of colour onto that sheet of tissue paper. So let's just talk for a second about what this tissue paper is. So I got this when I ordered what was called tracing paper from Amazon, and I just can't accept that this is tracing paper. To me, this is tissue paper. Here's the pack that it came in, and I bought this when I was playing at printing on Vellum. The pieces of paper have got a shiny side and a dull side. When I look at this, there is no way with how thin it is that I would want to do tracing with this. I think I would rip it. To me, let's just do it. To me, this is very like the kind of tissue paper that you use to wrap things with, maybe with bigger sheets. So I'm calling this tissue paper, but it might be that you call it tracing paper. I just wanted to share that it's very, very thin and very scrunchy. What we need is a sheet of this. I got it from Amazon, and we're going to convert it into something that allows us to cheat to make our cards look vintage. So I will begin by, I'm actually going to work through steps 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2 and 3 on our piece of paper here with the process steps on. I'm going to add a base colour, build up the texture, and then add top level detail with stamping. And to add the base layer, I'm going to use just basic paint. So I dug into some that I haven't used for some time, and I've got some little tubes of gouache colour. Now you can use watercolour paint, you could use paint that's in little pans. These happen to be in a tube. What I like about these, or the colours that I've chosen, is that they are slightly vintagey. So I've got, it calls it olive green, so it's quite a muted green. I'm picking 3 colours. Basically, use what you have and maybe pick some of those darker, more aged colours. What's this one? This is toffee. So these are little gouache artesa paints. And the reason I quite like these is they're relatively thick. And one of the key tips for this first step is to really minimise the amount of water you use. So what I'm going to do is just put small amounts of our paint all over our tissue paper. I do need a little bit of water, so I've got my pot ready, and I happen to be using, I think this is called a stippling brush. You could use foam. You don't have to have specific materials. Cut a piece off a sponge. I'm putting the merest tiny amount of water, and even that is probably too much. So I'll just run a bit over here to reduce it. And what I'm going to do is get some colour on my brush and then dab it. I really like the green one because it's rather dry. I need to use it. I'm going to dab it onto here. I've not completely mixed up all three colours together. I put a bit of all three on my brush, but I want a little bit of variety of colour on the page. And what I do is very gently, so you might be doing this with just a tiny piece of brush in your hand, just stipple or sponge over our tissue paper. Don't go absolutely everywhere and avoid dragging your brush. So we're not painting in the traditional sense. So I'm just working that over. It's looking rather green. So I think what I'm going to do is go back into one of these more coffee coloured colours of brown and fill in a few of the gaps. But again, don't fill in all of the gaps, and go really gently, be very delicate so that you're getting that texture in the way that your brush or your little piece of sponge lands. We're not trying to create a filter by painting all over it and just changing all of the colour. We're just trying to get some of that base layer of colour and turn our tissue paper into something a bit more interesting. So that is step one. It's rather relaxing really, isn't it? And it helps that I'm having a go at using some of these supplies that I haven't used for some time. Just feel a bit more inspiration when I dig into things that I don't use all the time. I want to mix things up a bit. I don't know about you. I need to keep feeling fresh about my craft by varying the supplies that I use. And also it means they don't go off or they don't dry out, and we get good value out of them, which is something I really like. So can you see I've got quite a lot on there, but it's not covering the whole thing. I've put my cutting mat behind the tissue paper. I hope that makes it just a little bit easier to see what we're doing to it. And next to this rather delicate sheet that we're going to add is a bit more of this vintage grunge effect. And again, I would encourage you to use what you have. What I'm going to do is add some of this brown and some of this delicate detail through some stamping. So I'm going to take these paint sticks. These are from Amazon. They're really quite cheap. They're from a brand called Little Brian, and they come in a set of about 20. And I particularly use the brown and the gold. In a way, I wish they'd sell them as singles. What I'm going to do is add a bit more of that texture. I'll take my brown, and again, being incredibly light-handed, I'm going to allow the weight of the paint stick to just travel across, and I'm adding just some lines. And as it moves across, can you hear that? It's bouncing a bit, and I'm getting more interesting texture. Again, I'm not colouring it in, and I'm okay that the paint from our first step is still quite wet. I'm also going to do a bit with the gold. This one's really well used. In fact, I think I used this one and this one a while ago when I created my first batch of faux vintage postcards. So I did some with some different techniques, and I think I used some chalk, I did some stamping, and we used some similar cardstock. So this is a variation on that theme. You seem to enjoy that one. I'll leave it linked in the video description box down below. I've added a tiny bit of water, but I'm being really circumspect about the amount of water that I add, because I've found that actually the best way to get this distributed, and just to smudge a bit, is to take my finger and rub on it. So I'm adding some, but it's not like I'm colouring in the gaps. So this is great because the gold does have that vintage aesthetic. What I would do is just take a tiny bit of water on my finger now and touch where some of that paint stick is just a bit thicker. I don't really feel the need to blend it all out. and I certainly don't want to rip my tissue paper. And as I've got my water pot and my paint out, I'm also going to just do a tiny bit of splatting with my now incredibly well used, as you can see, very mucky Kuretake paints. I'm going to take my water. I need to be very careful how much I put on. And let's get the merest... Oh, it's got some red on it. That was from painting the flower that I put on the front of one of them. Let's get just a tiny bit of black on, and I'm going to be very, very, very gentle. Just a few little splats, maybe even with my finger. They're really, really small dots. The other little technique, if you haven't got paint sticks, maybe you've got some form of gold paint. I like these. They've got so much glimmer in them. And you can also add a little bit of gold like that. And when it dries, it really does look fantastic. I feel it's got that vintage effect. So I'm going to move on to step 3, which is about adding detail. And I'm using stamps to do this. I've got a text stamp. I've got my postmark stamps, but really you can use whatever you have. I've got another stamp here, which again I hadn't used before, so I've pulled that out and I'm going to have a play with that. And I've got a few different types of ink pad. I want to start by building up a bit more of the base, so I'm going to use my text stamp here and just a little bit of ink, but I am going to go all over, because when I tear this and put it on a card, I want every piece of that tissue paper to have some text on it. So unlike some of the masterboards I create, where I sort of vary where I put my text, I'm literally working around it. I don't mind that there's still damp on here, that's okay. In fact, if any of the text touches a little globule of water and just blends a bit, I think that's really nice. So let's get that on. I've got a creaky chair. Okay, and one thing I'd probably say is be a bit more careful than I was then, in case your tissue paper sticks to the stamp and tears, because we don't want that. I am going to add, I think I'll do my postmark next. So for this one I am going to use black because I want it to be quite distinct. But I don't want too many of these, because you don't want it to look like you've got postmarks all over your pages. Really light-handed, it's probably enough. I'll use the wiggly lines, put those on, just overlapping the postmark stamp. And I'm also going to add a bit of a contrast, something modern. So I just happen to have a stamp with a zigzag strip, which you probably wouldn't think of using in our vintage style junk journaling, but I think it works incredibly well. Let me show you. So on this one, I've just got that mark coming out across here, and it contrasts really well with some of the rest of the vintage aesthetic on the card. So I'll take my archival ink and I'm going to get a few lines. Inevitably they're not going to be completely horizontal or level. Don't want too many, I want some that are really light-handed, but just enough to add texture when I use a piece of this. Maybe like that. At this point I was going to say, let's move on to step 4 by setting this aside and using one that I prepared earlier. And I do want to tell you how to make the best use of the scrappy bits as well that are left over, in case they don't fit your card. But I'm going to use the sheet that we have created today because it's actually nearly dry. What we need to move on to step 4, which is actually putting it all together, is a piece of that cardstock. So I've cut a few down. You can see how it's really quite gary, isn't it? It's quite garish, is that the word? Especially those with a bold amount of colour in the background. I like them, but they're not as vintage as I want them to be. So I've cut these down to, I think they're 6 inches by 4 inches. So they are, what does that equate to? About 10 centimetres by 15 centimetres. Basically, I've got 6 of these from an individual piece of that 12 by 12 cardstock. Let's just pick one of these and do a little bit of decoration. Which one shall we have? Let's do it on that one. That's got a lot of colour on in the roses. So what I need to do is attach the tissue paper gently to the cardstock, and then we're going to do the collage on top. So we're going to create something like these, and I really like using those birds on the back. You could also use there's a lovely image there. I think that's Rockwell Designs from Etsy. You could also use your stamped and painted images. So I've been doing a little bit of this on music paper, some of the metallic paints I've had fun with, whatever you want to make your focal point. But let's first of all do the delicate act of getting this onto here. I'm using a glue stick, and I find, so this is an Uhu glue stick, I find that this is completely see-through, so you don't see it. There's no issues with seeing it when you put the tissue paper on top, and it's also dry enough that it helps because this is very delicate. And the important thing really is in the flattening of this as we attach it. So what I'll do is get my corner as neatly as possible down there, line up the edges as neatly as possible. Let's do our best, but it doesn't need to be perfect. And then I'm going to try to just straighten that out. So let me I've just grabbed one of the other postcards, and I'm going to use that to just push away from myself to try to get this to go down as flat as possible. I've already got an undulation, and I'm okay because it's a glue stick. I'm just going to bring it back and get that down. And I actually don't mind if there's a little bit of wrinkle in this. I think it's part of the charm. So just pushing that away. I think that's good. Yeah, I like that little wrinkle. It's not perfect, but I think that adds to it. And now another of the tips. So how to get your edge, how to actually trim this. I'm going to take a knife, and I suppose it's good at this stage that I've got my cutting mat down. I'm going to really, as gently as I possibly can, almost not putting any pressure on it, butt the knife up against your card and run down it. And if you need to do it 2-3 times, that's fine. Just be incredibly gentle, and this just proves how thin the paper is actually. Rotate it, do the same again. I'm using the side of the cardstock to guide my knife so that I can get the straight line, and that's why it's also helpful to go quite slowly. So just cut through that, and we'll see if we've managed to go through it. If you haven't, we'll go back. That looks good. You could of course tear it, but I fear that if I tore it, it would just go haywire for me. And I want to make use of all of these pieces. So just nick the corner again. Looks like I've gone through it. Just a tiny little bit of pull and we're away. And that should give us the vintage backing. I did say I would help you use all of the pieces. So my tip, when I have this piece left over here, having filled one of my cards, it's not big enough to fill the whole thing. So what I've done is push it towards one end, and let me find one of the cards I've done it on. You hardly even see it. I did it on this one. I didn't go all the way to the edge. What I added was a piece of pink washi tape on the right hand side, and that just kind of covers in the gap, and in fact I think it adds to that vintage feel. So if you are left with pieces that look like they're going to be a bit of a waste because this isn't big enough to fill your whole card, maybe just fill a proportion of it and fill in the gap on the end with a little bit of washi or a piece of scrap paper. So we've backed it. What we want to do now is just grab any of our bits of ephemera, any of our images, or even a book page, and add a focal point on the front and then something on the back. And I think what I'm going to do is use a book page. This is the book that I've been using, and in fact what I like to do is have a look at the patterns and the colours in what remains of the card and maybe tune into that when I pick something from the book. I am wondering whether, because of the pinks in this card, the blues in here don't really work, so I'm going to, this happens to have opened at a purple page, that looks good. Get that out. What I'm going to do is choose something on here that is the right size. So I'm looking at this, obviously that's really tall. That's about the right size. I think I'll go for number 7 here. So I like the idea of tearing these, and the paper feels nice. I'll just get that out. And I'm going to get that on there, but obviously don't want a super straight line. I think I will give it a bit of a mat. Maybe use some of my collage paper. I'm actually running out. I made a huge batch not that long ago. I cannot believe how much I've gone through. I think that can sit on there, in which case that's too long. Let's get that down. A bit of glue. And you see how we might be covering up some postage mark there, but we've got a bit more up here. It's just a bit random where it lands. We'll get that on there. I want a bit more definition, so I'm going to use one of Tracy Fox's black labels. I think they're called labels, just to give it something else. So maybe one of these. Do you want it? That would add a lot on the left, wouldn't it? Let's work out. I think we'll have that there. That's good. I like the black and the pink. So I've got a really nice stamp. I don't want too much colour, but I'm going to add some extra bling. Get that on there. This is, I believe, a Stampers Anonymous stamp. I think it's called something like Life's Journey. It came in a set. And I'm going to give that some extra attention with my mica powder, which will stick to the ink and just give it a bit of an extra special. If I buff with the brush, it just makes it shine, and as it's adding itself to the ink, it shouldn't really come away. On the back, I'm going to add a little bit more collage, so something on the left, but again, it's completely up to you what you want to include. I've been definitely having fun with these birds, but you could cover the whole thing. I think that works really nicely. That's a bit of the old music paper that was left over, and I've also enjoyed leaving a space for journaling and using a vintage lady. These work particularly well. So I'm going to take my bird and get this on. And I also want, again, to give it just a little bit of a sense of a matte. I like this one because it's got a bit of purple in the wing here, which works incredibly well with the pattern that's left behind. And because we're taking about half of the back to be an image, it just reduces some of the extra vibrance all that extra busyness basically from the cardstock. Might have that on top actually. Just add something there, and I think I'm just going to add a little bit of my piano key washi on here, just something extra. Yeah, that's better. I don't know why, but it just is. So on this one, I think I would probably sew around it because I've taken the tissue paper all the way around, but it works just as well if you want to use faux stitching, and I think this is one of my favourites. I just added faux stitching on this. I'm just going to dig into some of my Inkonic pens because I want to add a boundary to that bird. So I'm going to match up maybe the colours here with something dark, maybe that one. I think this has got another row. Some lovely vintage colours in the bottom there. I'll add just a boundary before I sew this in faux stitching there. So I don't want to do that with a sewing machine. And then I'm just going to sew around it and we'll see what we've got. So I've set up my sewing machine and I just have a really dinky one. It happens to have the brown thread in it and that's what I'm going to use, and I will set it to number 2, which is running stitch, and then as I move around the card I'll move it to 4, which means it gets a small zigzag. It just adds a little bit of interest. It's my cute Hobbycraft MIDI sewing machine which I absolutely love, so I'll just do a quick whiz around it and we'll show you the finished item and a few of the others. So I'm just going to sew like this with maybe a bit of zigzag here and here, and I tend to start at the bottom and I do a little bit of forward and backwards to begin with. Let's see what we can do. I've left both of the little threads with about 1 inch remaining because I think that really helps. I think that's really nice. And now we've got the front and the back done, let's just have a look at all of the finished cards. Faux vintage postcards, how to cheat with tissue paper. If you've enjoyed this video then check out my video where I make these collage strips. I used lots of little scraps of paper and I think you'd really enjoy it. I hope to see you soon.